Alright, welcome back, grade 9s. Today we will continue our lesson on chapter 4 of the textbook. So there's 9 chapters in the textbook and we're on chapter 4. So that's always good news. We are on the chapter about collective rights. This is a part of our first major unit of the year, which covers chapters 1 through 5. So that means we'll have some unit exams next week. So I have 40 multiple choice questions waiting for you for next week. And they cover chapters 1 through 5. So if you're looking for some advice as to what you could do on a rainy afternoon and evening, you could certainly start looking back over what we've done. But today we're going to continue with chapter 4. And one of the skills that we're going to look at here with chapter 4 is cartoon analysis. So you may see cartoons on your multiple choice test, or you may see cartoons in your future for writing assignments. So when we get to Social 10, Social 10.1 and 10.2, both of those courses have cartoons as building blocks for one of their writing assignments. So I want to make sure that you have some preloaded skills here from grade 9 social that will give you an advantage next year. So here's an example of a cartoon. So looking at the cartoon, first thing that you should do with a cartoon is to try to see it as one picture. So taking it as one big picture, taking it as a whole, and then breaking it down into smaller pieces. So as we view the source as a whole, we can see it's making a comment about Canada. The title says Today's Canada. Anything in a cartoon that's in writing, any captions or titles, are typically quite purposeful in terms of helping us find the ideological perspective. So here it says Today's Canada. So we know the theme is Canada. It's communicating something to us about Canada. Now, cartoonists typically are trying to present an ideological perspective. Ideological perspective sounds like a complicated term, but all it means is an opinion, a viewpoint, what someone feels about something. So the cartoon here is showing us an ideological perspective about Canada. That marker does not. Ideological perspective about Canada. So we try to unpack the cartoon, meaning we look at details within it. We look at some of the details, some of the pieces of the illustration to try to find, what is the opinion about Canada? So when we look within that cartoon, we look at the smaller details. We can see that Canada is represented as a boat. So Canada is shown to be a boat. So here Canada is a rowing boat. Everybody can see that part, right? So Canada is shown as this metaphorical boat. Now, interesting to note is that the conditions for the people within the boat are not the same. So Canada is shown as a boat. So a boat is used as a metaphor to say, hey, this boat is Canada. So metaphor from English language arts is something that is used in place of something else. So in a story, you might have metaphors where the basketball might represent freedom, or the car might represent a dream. Here, the boat represents the nation of Canada, And the ideological perspective is that the conditions of the people within the boat are not equal. The ideological perspective, the opinion, is that the conditions for the people within the boat are not equal. Looking at that boat, who would you want to be? What position would you want to be in? So we have 4 options: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. If you were one of those 4 people, which one would you rather be? Maybe Ontario or Quebec because they're dry and they're not bailing water. So Alberta and Saskatchewan are bearing the difficulty of dealing with the problems of Canada. Alberta and Saskatchewan are being tasked with bailing the water. So bailing the water is a metaphor. Canada's not really a boat, but it's showing that Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're doing the work. Alberta, Saskatchewan, they're the ones doing the work. And Quebec and Ontario, they're the ones benefiting. And there's a cost to Alberta and Saskatchewan for doing the work. Their pants are wet. It's uncomfortable. It's laborious. But there's an added twist to this cartoon. So far we've said, big picture, cartoons about Canada. The title says Today's Canada. And then we looked at it and said, that boat is a metaphor for Canada. And there's an ideological perspective or a viewpoint about Canada today. And we can see it by looking at the conditions of the people within the boat. Alberta and Saskatchewan are bearing the burden of bailing water, while Ontario and Quebec are benefiting from that, sitting back and not working. Let's take a step back. Taking a step back, Quebec says, sure glad the hole isn't at our end. So there's a problem in the cartoon, isn't there? There's a problem that the people are wrestling with, and there's a hole in the boat. Again, the boat's a metaphor. So, there's not really a hole in the boat of Canada, but there's a metaphorical hole in the boat of Canada. Meaning there's a problem in Canada. So, the source is suggesting there's a problem in Canada. And Alberta and Saskatchewan are the 2 provinces that are forced to deal with the problem, whereas Ontario and Quebec are sitting back and not dealing with it. Now, I asked you a moment ago, which position would you rather be in? And Ontario and Quebec kind of get to sit back and not deal with the hole. But the reality is, would you want to be in a boat with a hole in it? Eventually, everyone sinks, including Ontario and Quebec. So even if they say, hey, sure glad the hole isn't at our end, they're still going to be affected by the hole. So even if the crisis is at the other end of the boat, and they sent Alberta and Saskatchewan to deal with the crisis, eventually, unless Alberta and Saskatchewan are so gifted, they can bail forever. Eventually that boat will capsize, it'll take on too much water, it'll sink. So the ideological perspective of the cartoonist is that Canada is like a boat with a hole in it. There's a problem in Canada, and not all Canadians are equally tasked with trying to find a solution. The solution is for some to work while others are bystanders. That's interesting to know. So it could be a criticism of Ontario and Quebec not doing enough. Could you see how the cartoon could be criticizing Ontario and Quebec and saying, hey, you need to do more. To save Canada, you need to do more. But another perspective might be that even if all four of them are bailing, they need to fix the hole. They can't just bail the water out. They need to deal with the source of the problem. So that could be another viewpoint being expressed here. Looking ahead at some of the textbook stuff that maybe you've done, some of the worksheet stuff that maybe you've done, do we have any language, any words, any vocabulary from this chapter that we can apply to this cartoon? What kind of emotion might Alberta and Saskatchewan be feeling? What kind of emotion might they feel? So at the beginning of this chapter, I suggested that we're going to learn a few things in chapter 4. We're going to concentrate on what are collective rights. We're going to look at the collective rights of Canada's Indigenous people. We're going to look at the collective rights of Canada's Francophones. But we're also going to look at something, some emotion felt in Western Canada, in Alberta, and also felt in Quebec. What was that emotion? Anyone? So the emotion is alienation. Alienation, being alienated, being left out, being excluded, being devalued, being marginalized. Alienation is when you feel excluded. Maybe there's a group of friends and they start, distancing themselves from one person in the group. They alienate them. They're like, we're going to exclude you. We're going to go for lunch, but you're not invited. You're being alienated. So some people in Alberta and Saskatchewan feel that because Ontario and Quebec have the population density, that Ontario and Quebec really control Canada. Because we're a democracy, because Ontario and Quebec have the majority of the people in Canada, they get to control Canada. And because of that, Alberta and Saskatchewan sometimes feel alienated. They feel marginalized. They feel excluded. And the cartoonist is saying more than, we're not just alienated, we're being used for their benefit. It's like colonization. That they're sitting back benefiting from us. And the idea is that the cartoonist is actually suggesting that the logic of Ontario and Quebec is broken. The logic is it's irrational what Ontario and Quebec are doing, because eventually the boat's going to sink for everyone. That's why it's illogical. When we look at the cartoon, though, there's something else we should take note of. Who's not in the boat? So there's a bias in this cartoon, yes. So there's no BC. So if you're from BC, I've got a lot of family in BC. My BC family might be looking at this and saying, so we don't even register? We don't even get to be in the boat? Well, that's fairly biased. Today's Canada has no room for BC, no room for Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland, Labrador, none of the territories. What else do we have missing? I look at the 4 people in the boat, and I might say, wait a minute. They all look quite, what? They all look, thinking of the chapter we're on, we might look at them and say, wow, I see 4 individuals. They all represent white Canada. I don't see any Indigenous people on board. This cartoon is biased. That there's a suggestion here that Canada today is being defined by 4 provinces, not 10. It's excluded the territories. There's no women on the boat. There's no ethnic minorities. And Canada is a nation founded by First Nations. I don't see First Nations on this boat. So when we look into cartoons, we need to pause. We need to first look at it as, big picture. What is this about? Oh, it's about Canada. Then smaller picture. Oh, Canada's being shown as a boat. Then, okay, why is it being shown as a boat? Well, there's a problem here that not everybody on the boat is equal, that their circumstances are not equal. The problem is there's a hole in the boat, and 2 of the 4 are being tasked with the responsibility of fixing it. And Ontario and Quebec just sit and watch. So maybe it's a commentary about federalism, and about how because of the population density in Ontario and Quebec, they get to dictate to smaller provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, leading to ideas of alienation, marginalization, and maybe the desire for separatism. But then when we think more critically, we can look at it and say, well, wait a minute, the boat's going to sink regardless. So this is meant to show that it's illogical for those power centers of Ontario and Quebec to not try to solve the problem of Canada. That by bailing water, they're just delaying the problem. They need to solve the problem. They need to fix the hole. And then when we think even more critically, we could say, oh, wait a minute, what's not in the source? I don't see women. I don't see ethnic minorities. I don't see Indigenous peoples. I don't see 6 of the 10 provinces or any of the territories. This is very biased. So a cartoon meant to be talking about marginalization has marginalized people. The cartoonist is showing that Alberta and Saskatchewan have been marginalized, but by not having any women in the cartoon, they have devalued the role women play in Canada. A cartoon showing how Alberta and Saskatchewan may feel alienated has alienated Canada's Indigenous people by not illustrating them within the cartoon. There's layers to cartoons. So we always have to look at the details, or what we call the nuances of the layers, to try to unpack it and say, okay, what's here? And the more layers we can get into, the more comprehensive and insightful we can be. We have different words to describe our ability to unpack it. If you just look at it and say, man, you know what, this is a cartoon about Canada, that's all I got. There's a problem in Canada. There's something missing in your answer. It's incomplete, right? It's probably 40% incomplete. If you look at it and say, okay, there's a problem in Canada, and Canada is shown as a metaphorical boat, and within that, not everyone's equal. Alberta and Saskatchewan are doing more work than anyone else. You get it, right? You get it. You straightforward, adequately get it, that's 60%. If you look at it and say, okay, the cartoon, the metaphor, boat, problem, Alberta, Saskatchewan, then you start adding words like alienation and separatism, and then you get the fact that it's illogical for the 2 people at the end of the boat to not be working because the boat will sink regardless. Now you have a sound understanding. It's 80%. Sound understanding. Then if you look at the boat and say, you know what, I get all those things, but I also see that there's no women, there's no Indigenous people. 6 of the 10 provinces are missing. None of the territories are here. That a cartoon about alienation is alienating, and that's ironic. Now that's comprehensive. That's insightful. That's 100%. So when we analyze or interpret cartoons, there's levels of understanding that we're meant to try to get to. All right, let's look at one more before we go outside and shiver in our mask break. So we have some more stuff that we're going to learn about Western alienation, so I'm going to skip that for now. We'll come back to it. All right. So, second cartoon. Trust me, the Indian Act is intact. So anytime that there's words on the page, that should help us to try to figure out, okay, what's the theme here? And then we have to look at the characterization, the characters, the relationship shown. So, big picture, what's the source about? It's about, yep, the Indian Act. The piece of government legislation from the 19th century that helps establish the relationship between Canada's federal government and our First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal peoples. It's about the Indian Act. So, is the ideological perspective of the cartoonist saying, you know what? There's nothing to be afraid of, that the federal government should be trusted because the Indian Act is intact. I mean, that's what it says right here, right? Trust me, the Indian Act is intact. So is the ideological perspective that Canada's First Nations or Indigenous Aboriginal peoples have nothing to worry about? Is that the perspective? Or is there some other detail that says, you know what? This is being said, but there's evidence that the cartoonist actually thinks otherwise. Within the cartoon, there's details within the cartoon that suggest that the ideological perspective is that the Indian Act is actually not intact. Let me ask you a question. Let's say that it's your birthday last week, and for your birthday, you received a signed, an autographed poster, some kind of portrait of someone that you hold dear to you. Some kind of iconic hero in your life, whoever that may be. So, let's pretend for me it's the Queen. So I got a picture of that Queen over there, next to her husband, Prince Philip. So, if that picture of the Queen was in the same circumstances as the Indian Act is shown in this cartoon, do I have anything to worry about? So, it's a treasure of mine, right? I'm worried about it. So we can assume that this gentleman on the left has come to the gentleman on the right, and he's asked, should I be worried about the Indian Act? That's what happened before the cartoon. We can assume that's what happened because this is the response. Trust me, the Indian Act is intact. Somebody doesn't just come up and say, hey, trust me. The person's been asked something before. Something happened before the cartoon. And the representative of the government, shown on the right, was asked, hey, what's the current condition of the Indian Act? And he says, trust me, it's fine. Something about that cartoon says it's not fine. So my example is, what if I value that photo of the Queen over there, and I put that this photo of the Queen in your hands, in your trust? Much like the Indian Act is in the trust of the federal government. Canada's Aboriginal peoples have put the Indian Act in the hands of Canada's federal government, and they're trusted with that. It's something very valuable, and it's trusted with that. If this is something that I value, because it's old, and I say, you know what, I'm going to trust you with it. And then I see that it's in the garbage can. Should I be concerned? What happens to the things in the garbage can? They get picked up, they get thrown out. So the ideological perspective of this cartoonist is that the Indian Act is being discarded, that it was being thrown out, that given time it wasn't going to exist anymore. Something that is put in the garbage can that's thrown out, given time will no longer be there. So what we can infer means hypothesize, it means we can guess. What we can guess, what we can infer, what we can hypothesize is that the government has an agenda to get rid of the Indian Act, and this guy caught him. He said, oh, wait a minute, what's the status of that? I want to see it. And the guy's like, oh, don't worry, but he's hiding it, right? The government's hiding it behind his back and saying, oh, just trust me, it's fine. But in reality, it's not fine. He wants to throw it out. So this is a reference to the agenda of the government to get rid of the Indian Act, and we talked about that yesterday. So, the neat thing about this cartoon is there are steps here that help us analyze the cartoon. So, step one, just glance at the picture and try to get a holistic, a big picture thing and say, okay, what's our gut saying about what's happening here? Two guys are meeting. This guy is a businessman, but he's also dressed in cultural attire so that I know what group he represents. This guy could be a garbage man, but he's in a suit, so he's probably not a garbage man. But based upon this and this, maybe he's a guy that works for the government. Consider your background knowledge, what you already know about the context of the source. When might this have taken place? So yesterday we talked about the Canadian government wanting to eliminate the Indian Act with the white paper. This could be a cartoonist thinking about the white paper. Find labels. Well, here's a label right there. So that's how we know they want to get rid of it, because that piece of paper right there is labeled. If it wasn't labeled the Indian Act, I'd have no idea what that means. But it's labeled on purpose. That's the significance of labels within cartoons. Notice the people in the photo. Do they have facial expressions that are exaggerated? Anything oversimplified or exaggerated to make the message clearer? Well, I don't think that they would really put it in the garbage can like that, but it's being exaggerated so we know what's happening, which is the devaluing of Canada's Indigenous peoples, and specifically the throwing out of the Indian Act. Identify possible bias or viewpoint. Well, the viewpoint here is clearly anti-government, because they're associating the government with, what are they doing? They're committing some kind of fraud, the government is. They're lying, right? The government's lying here. So it's biased against the government. They're attributing the government with an agenda to mislead, to deceive, to lie to Canada's Indigenous peoples. So, in summary, we'll see cartoons this year. We'll see them on multiple choice, but moving ahead to grade 10, 11, and 12, cartoons will play an even bigger role in how you're evaluated, how we hold you accountable for the content we study. We want you to be able to look at sources and to see the topics that we're covering. We want you to look at this source and see collective rights. We want you to look at this source and see problems like alienation. Again, you might see cartoons in multiple choice this year, but long term you'll be writing about them as well. So I'm going to end it there, then we can talk about it a little bit, and then we'll have our mask break outside.